let's let Jessica and Bo get started.
Thank you very much. Welcome back just after lunch. I see a lot of new faces in the room too, which is very good. We've still got, we'll have some folks trickling in as the rest of the session continues. And this is the public policy of things. So the idea is we wanted to come in and bring you a perspective from DC on some of the activities that have happened in the congressional, so the congressional activities, some of the agency activities, so the executive branch, some of the things that have gone on in the last few years to kind of set the stage for going forward over the next few years on how we can help build better public policy in DC. And we brought Jessica Wilkerson here. Jessica is a live, tame congressional staffer. She does not bite usually, but she does help a bunch of us have our voices heard in the Hall of Congress. And she's going to fill us in. We had this on the agenda for just like a one-to-many kind of talk, but we figured we would do more of a fireside chat style. So give Jessica some time to give some context, really, and then go over in some more detail some of the specifics. So Jessica, why don't you tell us about your journey, kind of how you got here, and especially over the last 4 years or so since you've been in DC, how things have changed, how you've seen things change, particularly with respect to the Internet of Things, as well as with respect to how security researchers and hackers have been seen in DC.
Okay, I think I can manage that. So, again, I'm Jessica Wilkerson. I work for the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, which is one of the biggest committees within the House of Representatives. We have jurisdiction over everything from healthcare to energy to telecommunications to commercial issues, cars. We pretty much run the gamut if it's not law enforcement, intelligence. There's one I'm forgetting, and that's all right. National security, that's the other one we don't have. And so that gives me a very, very broad look at everything that's happening within cybersecurity within the federal space, because our committee ends up touching on a lot of it. And as Bo said, I started on the Hill 4 years ago, straight out of college. I do have a computer science and mathematics background. It was sort of a long and winding journey to how I ended up with Congress. It's worked out quite well, but I don't feel ashamed admitting that it was a complete accident. But, you know, I think it's been really interesting to me watching how Congress in particular has evolved over the last 4 years when looking at cybersecurity issues, because when I first got there, so this is back in 2013, cybersecurity was solely a breach-focused law enforcement or intelligence community issue, and that was it. You weren't going to talk about the vulnerability of medical devices. Like, maybe you touched on whether or not somebody could hack the grid, but nobody ever thought it was possible, and why would you waste time on it? Smart cars, smart devices, those things were starting to come up, but you know, nobody was really that concerned about it. I mean, I think this was back before really broad HTTPS adoption, so that, you know, we weren't quite there yet. And you could really see that with the way that Congress approached these kind of cybersecurity issues. When you had hearings that were supposed to be on technical issues, it was always on, well, the X company was breached. So obviously they failed somehow, and we need to punish them. We need to ratchet up the requirements that they have to meet, so HIPAA or the PCI standards or anything like that. And if we do that, if we put more stringent standards, then we'll never have any more breaches ever. And obviously that's not true. So what I have found particularly interesting is that over these last 4 years, it has switched from being a law enforcement and intelligence community issue to being an everybody issue. And the thing that the way that we've ended up explaining this to people is that there are a lot of companies who used to be physical product companies. You made a car, you made a medical device, you made whatever, and you made a physical product. And in some cases, maybe you put software in it. And you still have people who think about in that kind of frame of mind a lot, but the way that we have started communicating to our companies, our constituencies, so the hospitals, energy companies, retailers, things like that, we've essentially started telling them, you are not physical product companies anymore who happen to have a software component to what you're doing. You are a software component, or you're a software company who happens to put software in a car or happens to put software in a medical device. So instead of looking at cybersecurity issues as a very small component of what you're doing, it needs to be your primary consideration, because if you don't have security, you can't have privacy. If you don't have security, you can't be reliable. And these are all the kinds of buzzwords that get thrown around in DC. I mean, if you're talking about grid, you're talking about the grid being reliable. If you're talking about financial issues, you're talking about the security and the privacy of financial information and personal information. So in trying to get people to switch to that paradigm shift, it's been a very, very long, winding road, but we're starting to get there. And a lot of that, I think, is due to the more welcoming interaction that a lot of congressional committees and other parts of the federal government are having to the information security community. You know, when I think I was just telling Bo a story from a couple of years ago, just two, which it seems like it should be so much longer, but this was when medical device vulnerability disclosures were really starting to become a little bit more routine. But this was one of the first, and this one was pretty severe. And the company who was affected, we ended up meeting with the company just to find out more information about what was going on. And they were, you know, this security researcher is completely untrustworthy and he's making things up and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And also, like, this random thing on his website just shows that he has weird political views. And so we shouldn't listen to anything he says, and neither should you. And it was a ridiculous argument to make at the time. It is still a ridiculous argument. But, you know, you had people in Congress who were a little bit more receptive to that, because your community was just so alien to Congress. And I mean, sometimes you can still hear this myth of the 400-pound hacker in the basement. Like, those things still get thrown around. But now you're starting to get a little bit more of a thing where when we have issues like Mirai, or when we have issues like medical device hacks, or what happened with with Charlie Miller and Chris Vilasek and the Jeep, we don't immediately panic, and we don't immediately call the Department of Transportation. We do call the Department of Transportation, but then we'll reach out to Chris and Charlie directly. We'll reach out to, you know, the folks who are talking about their research. We'll reach out to them directly and actually hear from them. What happened? What do you recommend? All these other things. And it's much more of a collaborative process than this adversarial, well, you broke the law because obviously security research is bad, and all these other things. And I think that in addition to this idea of switching from a law enforcement and an intelligence community focused way of looking at cybersecurity has been very helpful. So that is probably what I would say is like the big overview for me and for my committee when it comes to cybersecurity. I don't know if you wanted to dig into specific issues.
Yeah, so that's Congress and that's your committee, and clearly things have changed over the last few years. A lot of the action that's gone on has, in respect to Internet of Things, public policy, has come from the executive branch. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to or can give any insight to some of the different organizations and agencies that have oversight and how they have oversight in those areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can do. So one thing to understand about government and about Congress in particular is we're very territorial. So each part of the government has jurisdiction over certain pieces. In Congress, it gets broken up by Energy and Commerce's jurisdiction over HHS and the Department of Energy. And so anything that happens with those agencies, we're technically supposed to handle. And the Committee on Homeland Security deals with the Department of Homeland Security and so on and so forth. And this is the same for different federal agencies. So got Health and Human Services, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, XYZ, things like that. So what's been really interesting for me is looking at an issue, for example, that I think is relevant to you guys, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. There has been this groundswell of support of different federal agencies who, government, not always the best at coordinating within itself, who have nonetheless all come out and said, this is an expected behavior from these sectors. So FDA issued its post-market guidance saying, medical device companies, we expect you to work with security researchers. NHTSA came out and said the same thing. NHTSA regulates automobiles. You have the ongoing NTIA process. I don't know if any of you actively participated in NTIA's process. And then even the Department of Homeland Security within their guidance has said, coordinated disclosure is an expected part of a cybersecurity program. So, where sometimes the government really struggles to coordinate and have a unified message. I think at least with an issue like coordinated vulnerability disclosure, it's become such a common sense thing for different parts of the federal government that instead of now being a question of, is coordinated disclosure good? Is working with security researchers good? The answer is just a default yes. And now it's how do we finish getting there? So I think that has been really impressive. Piece of the coordinated disclosure program. Bit.
Yeah. And I'm going to try and throw some slides up if it will work. I'm not sure if my laptop's yet configured right. But there's been a number of, in the past 12 to 18 months, there's been a number of executive branch as well as congressional actions around the Internet of Things. And maybe I'll just go through a couple of these verbally if it's not going to show up on the screen. But things like the Presidential Commission Report, which I know that you're familiar with. You mentioned the FDA guidance. There was also a Health and Human Services Task Force report that you can probably talk in some detail about. We're going to have a conversation about that later on today as well. When Josh is here, I think that's going to be about 6 p.m., I think, for a half an hour. There's been a lot of work within Department of Transportation and NHTSA, which I believe you mentioned. Let's see if I can do this now without crashing. Oh, there we go. Federal Trade Commission has come out and done some things around the Internet of Things. We have Alan Friedman speaking a little bit later on today here, Department of Commerce and NTIA on some of the multi-stakeholder processes. I don't want to go too deep into any of those necessarily, but just on the whole, the point of this slide is that there's been a lot of action. Jessica, you mentioned coordinated disclosure, and this is roughly speaking some of the actions and activities that have gone on around coordinated disclosure in the conversations in the federal government over the last 12 to 18 months. And I think the point that I'm taking away from looking back now that I've got a chance to sit down and do a retrospective is that there's a lot of things going on that are very, very cavalry shaped and cavalry focused. So if you look at, for instance, some of the Department of Transportation work, they put out in January 2016 a set of their priorities for the year. And the number one, one of the number one priorities that they had, for instance, was that they wanted to get more engaged and involved in the security researcher community and understand how it works, help build more ties and relationships. And they actually treated or seemed to be treating security researchers as friends rather than potential adversaries. And this wasn't just an academic thing that a few people said. It was actually signed on to by, I think, 16 or 17 car brands that sell in the United States, including all the major ones that you know. And that was really, really impressive to me that the federal government was leading on that in automotive. Of course, we've got a great precursor to that, which was the FDA work that Suzanne Schwartz and her team did. Suzanne's in the room, and we'll be hearing from her in a little bit as well, on building guidance to industry on pre-market and post-market, which is basically why you're going through the clinical trials and approvals. And then after you get approval, looking at what's happened in the healthcare landscape to some of your devices, as well as many, many other things. I know that coordinated disclosure is one of the top of your list, and you actually even have an acronym for it.
I do.
Because it can't be a government thing without an acronym. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of the work, some of the things that you've done, particularly on coordinated disclosure, and then what you've seen through the rest of government on coordinated disclosure as well.
Yeah, so I call it CODIS, coordinated disclosure. primarily because I got tired of typing coordinated disclosure in emails to people, and now it's just become the shorthand way for my committee to refer to it. So we'll see how that goes. But the way that we've approached coordinated disclosure, so the big secret of Congress, or maybe it's not a secret, I guess this would be the assumption, is that when Congress wants to do something, somebody writes a bill, somebody writes a piece of legislation, and you go through this whole big process where you debate, you try to get passed into law, and so on and so forth. But the thing that is starting to become clear to Congress, and that I think my committee has accepted already, is that cybersecurity standards don't actually get you better cybersecurity. In other words, compliance is not security. You can be compliant without being secure. And so we have tried to step away from legislation as a solution to cybersecurity issues because it's just not agile enough. The technology changes far more quickly than Congress can pass laws. So we need a different way of affecting change. So what we have started doing are these roundtables. And we essentially gather a group of people together into a room who we think is relevant to a conversation. We shut them in for about 2 hours, and we say, here's a problem statement. Here's what we think or would like to see. You got 2 hours to essentially come up with what we should do next. And we've actually had a tremendous amount of success with these roundtables because it just allows people who might not have the same, or might not have a reason to be in a room together, to come together and try and collaborate on what a problem is. Congress has an immense ability to convene. You know, when Congress calls, people answer, because if you don't answer Congress, we have other ways of making you talk to us, and all of them are less pleasant. So, you know, if I can, more so than other people, I can pick up the phone, call somebody and say, hey, we want you to be here at X time for Y reason, and while we may be able to have a conversation about the details and the merits, chances are they're going to be there. So for groups who are all involved in the same industry or all involved in the same sector and facing the same problem but might have different ideas about how to solve it or different equities and things that they need to consider when doing it, you know, we can kind of be the people who say, we need you to be in the same room at the same time and we'll work it out. So we did that with coordinated disclosure. We started doing that, I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, was the first roundtable that we had. And I remember being very pleasantly surprised because I expected that conversation to be a whole big, potentially acrimonious debate about, is coordinated disclosure good or bad? And the surprising thing for me is we had 20 people in the room, maybe, and pretty much everybody came in and said, oh yeah, coordinated disclosure is a good thing. We're absolutely planning on doing it. Some people in the room already had done it and were working through their process. It was just for everybody, it was more of a conversation about how do we do it? How do we get there? And so, you know, I think the other thing that we found very valuable coming out of that roundtable is, instead of Congress imposing a policy on all of these stakeholders, they essentially came back to us and said, now that we've had a chance to brainstorm with other people who are in the same boat and facing the same kind of issues that we are, this is what we think we should do. And we as Congress, instead of trying to be like top down, we're going to make you do something, we essentially said like, all right, that sounds great. Like, we'll check in with you in 2 months. And that's the way that we've been handling it. And then, I mean, for example, you know, there was a big blow up in the coordinated disclosure world a couple months after that first roundtable when Muddy Waters and MedSec did their pacemaker vulnerability drop, where they did it in the press. They didn't give the company any warning. It was just, you know, just threw it out there. And we, as the committee, were not huge fans of that. For us, there were really serious patient safety concerns with the way that disclosure happened. And so what we did is we essentially went back to the same group of people who we had convened originally, including members of the research community. I think I should have said that before. Like, I think I can admit, Bo was there, so was Josh. We went back to the same group of people and essentially said, we don't like what happened. We don't want this to cause a backslide in federal government and company acceptance of coordinated disclosure and their willingness to work with the research community. So what do we do? How do we address this in a constructive manner rather than everybody just slamming the door in researchers' faces and saying, well, one of you screwed up and did a really bad thing, so now we're not going to work with any of you. And we had a really great conversation. And after that, we have some things that we're still working on internal to the committee that we're trying to do next steps on coordinated disclosure. But I think that the big takeaway for us is that there had already been such a groundswell of acceptance and such the people at these companies, they'd seen the value. For some of them who had coordinated disclosure programs, they'd received really great disclosures, and it helped up their products in a way that they didn't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. They didn't have to go through a big regulatory action. They didn't have to have a big congressional investigation into a screw up on their part. And so to them, the cost-benefit ratio of these kind of programs was so good that it wasn't a concern anymore. I think those kind of less traditional congressional and federal government approaches when it comes to cybersecurity issues are very valuable.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, that the trust that you've built with the security research community over the past few years is shining through, and even people with high-powered lobbyists and other things can't convince you to stop working with security researchers. And that when you see bad acts and bad action, you don't lump all security researchers in as the same type of person. You recognize that there are differences in motivation and actions and behaviors and other things. And I think that that's an underappreciated part of what certain people in government can and will do if given the chance, is to build and maintain that trustful relationship. One of the things when we started the Cavalry and we started saying, maybe we need to talk to public policymakers a little bit more than avoid them. What we heard is, well, you'll never do that unless you have $10 million to spend every year on a lobbyist. And what we found is that actually that's not the case, that the government has people who are just as committed and passionate to human life and public safety issues as we are in the security research community. And that it doesn't take a megaphone or deep pockets to actually engage and have a substantive conversation, that there are people who really want to listen, especially today. There are people who really, really want to be right and want to be smarter. And I wonder if you saw a change between pre-WannaCry, not Petya, and post-WannaCry, not Petya. You talked about the longer scale change, multiple years, but just within the last few months, what have you seen across government that has shifted because of those very, very high-profile, high-impact attacks?
Yeah, so WannaCry was a huge deal for my committee because we have jurisdiction over healthcare, which means that theoretically speaking, we could have opened up an investigation into any company who was hit, or we could have opened up an investigation into the Department of Health and Human Services, I guess. I don't really know what...
You watched what happened in the UK.
Right.
And while thankfully we didn't have too much of an impact in the US, it was maybe a warning sign. And it's not just healthcare, of course. It's
No.
manufacturing facilities and being, commerce and energy. You have jurisdiction over a lot of what happens in the U.S. economy, which is intimately tied to Internet of Things. It's intimately tied to manufacturing robots, to cars, to healthcare, to aviation, and to other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice things about that paradigm shift I was saying for the way that Congress has been approaching issues is that WannaCry could have very easily turned into just a mess where you could have had a bunch of committees opening up investigations into what happened, but they probably wouldn't have gone about it in a very intelligent way, and so you could have had these dueling congressional committees that didn't actually get you anywhere. At least for my committee, what I thought was really nice about the way that our members handled the issue is that we set up a call for them with a handful of experts on the issue to talk them through what had happened and why it mattered. And somebody on that call essentially made this claim of the United States got really lucky, because I think some of our members had, when looking at that issue, with looking at what happened with the UK, they were like, oh, well, the United States must just be really good and really well prepared for these kinds of things because we didn't get hit at all. And in the back of my head, I was like, oh God, that's not the case at all. And so we had somebody on the call, this expert on the call, who essentially said, we just got lucky. Like, somebody just found a way to shut it off, like, 20 minutes, an hour before the United States would have started getting systematically demolished by this incident. And I think because of some of the groundwork and because of the really dedicated action that some of these experts have invested in our committee and our members over the years, our members got that. That we didn't have to have this big, long fight with them about, what being lucky in this context meant. And instead, we got to move straight into, okay, well, if we got lucky, then that means we're vulnerable. So if we're vulnerable, what do we do about it? And you had a couple folks who were like, okay, well, obviously we need to update HIPAA. Because if we were all vulnerable to WannaCry, then HIPAA is outdated and we need to update HIPAA. And then you had a couple of other members who were like, that's probably not the right approach. So what do we do? And then, luckily, there were a couple of other things context-wise that were happening right when WannaCry hit. We knew, for example, the healthcare cybersecurity industry task force report was coming out. And so we kind of said, all right, not that everybody isn't still vulnerable, not that there isn't still a giant problem, but we know that this report is coming out. All right, and if we're going to be honest, it had leaked in the press right around the time this had happened. And so we knew what the report was going to say, even though we couldn't really admit that we knew what the report was going to say. And, we instead of saying, let's update HIPAA and let's make another big compliance regime and let's start fining companies huge amounts of money every time that they make a mistake, we essentially said, okay, Congress essentially said, get a bunch of experts together into a room and ask them what they think should be done about healthcare cybersecurity. One, ask them what's wrong with healthcare cybersecurity, and then two, ask them what they think should be done about it. And so we said, we in a moment of really uncharacteristic foresight, we asked them a year ago to do this. The report's ready, and they have a bunch of recommendations for us. So we took the report, we looked at what the report said, and that kind of became our roadmap. We essentially said, okay, they said that legacy devices are a big problem. They said that a lack of transparency into what software is included in a particular device is a big problem. So you had the hospitals who had devices that were vulnerable, but either they didn't know that those devices were running on their networks, or they didn't know that SMBv1, the vulnerable protocol, was in those devices. All right, so the software transparency bit is a huge problem. The legacy devices is a huge problem. We've got a workforce problem where you've got folks who are really smart in IT, but not necessarily smart in healthcare, because the healthcare realities of IT make it a little bit more complicated than you have a vulnerable product, just shut it off or just disconnect it from the internet. Can't always do that in healthcare. So that became the way that we sort of channeled all of our members' concerns about healthcare. Was, we've already asked a bunch of smart people, let's do what they said. Let's not try and reinvent that wheel. Let's look at what they said and let's do what they said.
Yeah. So that sounds like it was a powerful catalyzing moment where you actually had something ready to go, like you said, in an odd moment of foresight. You had thought about this a year ago. So you actually had the ability to go out and reach out to these experts who had been studying the issues. Mm-hmm. What issues do you see coming in the future that might be worth looking into or studying from a congressional standpoint, or without predicting the future? What issues might be on the top of Congress's mind or the rest of the government's mind in the coming 6 to 12 months?
So if I had to pick one, I would say IoT, Internet of Things. I don't think I'm supposed to say Internet of Things actually anymore. I think my committee prefers that I say connected devices, but whatever. So when Mirai hit, everybody collectively lost their minds for about 48 hours. Very slowly, though, because some of us had very degraded internet access, so we were less able to yell at each other over email. But, everybody was just like, oh, my God, what do we do? The internet is under attack, and we have to, well, the first instinctual thing that everybody said was, oh, we have to find the people responsible. We have to find the people responsible for Mirai, and we have to arrest them. And I remember me and some of the staff on my committee, we just kind of were like, no, Like maybe, I guess, if you can find them, then that's great, but that's probably not the most beneficial use of everyone's time. Let's instead look at, how could this happen? How could a bunch of cameras take down this much of the internet? That seems wrong. And so if that's wrong, what do we do about it? And I think what we've seen is that not just Congress, but other parts of the federal government have really started to focus on this. There was an executive order that mentioned botnets, and there's these big, government initiatives to how we fight botnets. And so I think, from my own personal perspective, that the focus on botnets is a little bit odd. I think it's important, but I don't think it's the primary issue. I think the issue is that we keep making really crappy devices and then being surprised when they get taken over and used for nefarious things. So if I had to pick out like one set of issues that I think is really going to be top of mind for government, it's this whole botnet IoT issue and how we handle that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the executive order they call for Department of Commerce and others to study the issue, and Alan Friedman is doing a lot on looking at botnets. He's raising his hand.
Stay tuned for the next panel.
Stay tuned for the next panel. This is advertising. We're in the ad business now. Full transparency. But as you said, it's not so much about that botnets exist. It's the conditions that have led to botnets.
Yeah.
And particularly in the Internet of Things, because we've had botnets for maybe a decade or so.
Yep.
Of hijacked browsers and things like that creating botnets. But in the Internet of Things, it's potentially a very different issue. And talking about some of the fundamentally indefensible practices that go into making the Internet of Things. I don't know if you want to say much about some of the things that you might be looking at or thinking about to shore up some of the security in those, or if you want to save that for later.
No, I can talk about that. So we have a couple of things. One of them is, I mentioned the healthcare industry task force report before. One of the things that is coming out of that is this idea of software bill of materials. And essentially what that is if you, Daniel does software bill of materials, so he's very excited.
Talk tomorrow morning.
Yeah, he's got more advertising. But generally the idea is if you are giving somebody a product, a smart product, you are also giving them a list of what that smart product contains. So I tend to think of it in medical devices because, frankly, that's been most of my life lately. But if it has embedded Windows XP, then that's on a list. If it uses OpenSSL, then that's on a list. And what's the version numbers of all these things that it's containing? So if you have something like a WannaCry incident, you have a big database or spreadsheet or something that says, okay, I need to look for SMBV1, and according to my little cheat sheet of software bill of materials, here are the devices that are affected, and voila, I know what I need to protect. So for us, that's a big one. One that we focus less on, but I know our friend Alan and NTI are focused on is patching and updatability. So I think that is a huge focus that I think needs more attention. Another big one, I might have just lost this might be an oddly specific one, but the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program. I don't know if any of you have been dealing with CVE lately. More dealing with CVE around about 2015 when it was having some of its issues. We are of the opinion that the CVE program is fundamental to internet security today. That it's the common language that we all speak when it comes to vulnerabilities, and so that program really needs to be made stronger and more effective. So we are looking into the CVE program and how we can do that. But essentially, our bottom line is let's not try and take a compliance-focused view of cybersecurity. Let's not impose more standards and regulations and guidelines and everything else, because from my perspective, the proliferation of cybersecurity standards is becoming a cybersecurity threat in and of itself, because for a lot of people, smaller companies especially, who are just really starting to recognize what I was saying before, that they are software companies who might happen to put that software in physical products, if you've got 15 cybersecurity standards that you're somehow supposed to pick from in order to be secure, well, how are you supposed to do that? So we're trying to take to the botnet issue and to the medical device issue and WannaCry and all these other things, instead of trying to force retroactively security onto these things, it's how do we create an environment that fosters better security from the beginning. So how do you have updatable products? How do you have software development materials so that you know what you're buying? Maybe that influences your buying decisions. If somebody has a product with more updated libraries, maybe you choose that one. I don't know. But if you have better security from the beginning, then that's great. I think we also need to recognize, and we have started to recognize, 100% security is a myth. You're never going to be 100% secure. So if that's the case, then you need to be able to fix that when it comes to the coordinated vulnerability disclosure piece is huge for us. I think just overall, it's just, we need to be more agile. We need to be more accepting of cybersecurity issues. In the past, we'd have a hearing or we'd have a big blow up every time a company experienced a breach. Target got hauled in for a hearing back in 2014, 2013, whenever that was, when they had their breach. And so we've tried to stop doing that, and generally just create a more fostering environment for security.
Yeah, it sounds like, if I can extrapolate a little bit and abstract, for the last few years, or up until at least a couple of years ago, in Congress and other aspects of government, it seems like this cybersecurity thing or this InfoSec thing was just something that was a passing fad and it was going to go away.
Right.
You'll deal with it as it comes up. But by and large, private sector, they've got it. They know how to handle it. They're all over it. And now it sounds like Congress, at least, and your committee, at least, probably for some very good reasons, is understanding that it's not going away, that it will be something that's increasing over time as our dependence on connected technology grows faster than our ability to secure it. We will continue to have these issues, and so getting ahead of them is probably the thing that they need to do.
Yeah.
So given that, if they are going in that direction, then how do you see the next few years shaping up? More of a long-term crystal ball, less of a short-term action? So,
at least from my committee's perspective, and I would expect the more forward-leaning agencies like FDA and NHTSA in this case, and HHS actually, the Department of Health and Human Services, has gotten really good at this as well. I think we're going to continue trying to take this collaborative, very open process where instead of trying to impose policies on industry or on the security research community, we're instead going to solicit them and essentially say, we are not going to be the smartest people in the room on this topic. I have a computer science and a mathematics background. I by no means consider myself to be a cybersecurity expert. So instead of saying, hey, I sat alone in my office for 2 hours and I thought about a problem and I think the answer is X, and then writing essentially a bill that says, industry, thou shalt do X because I thought it's a good idea, it's more likely that we'll have these kinds of collaborative discussions with industry and with the research community and essentially say, here's the problem statement. You do this every day. You're far more enmeshed in this than we are. What do you think we should do? And then what is, I think, likely to happen, at least from my committee's perspective, is we'll take those suggestions, we'll roll them into the policy realities because you can't ever get away from politics and politics. And then, we'll synthesize something between the tech expertise that we solicit and the policy expertise that we have, and we'll come up with a working solution. So I think with things like the botnet issues and the IoT issues, it's not going to be us saying, well, smart device manufacturers, you just have to make your products less stupid. It's going to be, you need to be updatable. You need to be transparent about what's included in your products. You need to be these other things because that's what we've been told will get us there for things like medical devices. We need to put the tech people and the healthcare providers in a room together so that they can have a discussion about, okay, we can't just unplug the pacemaker, I don't think you unplug pacemakers, but bear with me. We can't just unplug the pacemaker because that would kill somebody, but it has a cybersecurity vulnerability. We need to do something. So tech person, hospital person, figure it out, and then tell us, and we'll help you do it. Maybe the best way to put this, instead of me continuing to ramble, is that my committee, Congress, I think we want to be the conveners. We want to be a welcoming enough face of government that people can come to us and tell us what they think their solution should be, and then we can help implement them to the best of our abilities. Because I think, again, I would just repeat, like, we don't believe that we're the experts. We don't believe we should be the experts. We would prefer that we don't have to be the experts.
Yeah, and abstracting again from what you said, it sounds almost as if you're saying that regulation might not be the only power that government has. Mm-hmm. And that even within regulation, there might be some ways to do it that aren't as heavy-handed as a lot of people in this community fear. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually one of the ways that I'll put this, I'll let you in on one of my secret powers of Congress. My ability to ask really stupid, clueless questions, or at least what people think are really stupid, clueless questions, get me very far. If I'm sitting in a group, for example, with the coordinated disclosure debate, early when we were starting to discuss this with car manufacturers and medical device providers and energy grid operators, if I just kind of sat there and looked a little clueless and was just like, well, but what would happen if somebody came to you and said you had a vulnerability in your system? Like, what would you do with that? And then to just see them kind of be like, we don't know, and then realize that if they have to give us a better answer than we don't know, or we'll find an answer for them, and they're not going to like it. So that ability to kind of insinuate that either figure this out yourself or we'll figure it out for you, and by the way, you won't like what we say, is a very, very powerful driver. Because, 2 months later, you can essentially ask a clueless question like, well, what would happen if? And then they'll be like, no, don't do anything. Just give us a little bit of time and we'll come back to you. And then 2 months later, suddenly, they're like, here it is. We sat down and we figured out the answer is X. So I think that will be the larger trend of cybersecurity issues across government.
Yeah, and then beyond just the power of convening in Congress, there's also federal agencies. Looking around, I see several friendly faces, and I don't want to call all of them out, but different parts of government have different types of authorities. And, some can regulate, so they can impose things on industry. Some can mediate, so they can kind of get in the middle of certain conversations. If one organization is maybe not responding to researchers, then someone like ICS CERT can come in and help mediate that discussion. Some have convening power in a different way, a more public and open way, and I know Alan would love to talk about that. He might even have a couple of talks this week on it, but doing things like being able to build, to bring industry together, to come up with a common way of doing things, and to essentially define a standard or something that can act more or less as a community or industry-driven standard to be implemented. So there are multiple ways that government can go about bringing together these conversations or having these conversations. That doesn't always mean if government is involved, there must be regulation that comes out of it. But at some point, those types of conversations will break down. The industry won't be leading, or they won't be leading in the right ways. And at that point, there might be a threshold whereby regulation or legislation is needed. And I know that the current administration is very regulation light. They would like to see less regulation going on, legislation that pulls away some of the heavy hand of government on industry. And I wonder if you could spend a couple of minutes talking about what some of those mechanisms can look like if, once legislation is required, what could go into place that would be less heavy-handed or be seen as less of an inhibitor on industry?
So full disclosure, you're talking to, in Congress, you have two kinds of staffers. You have legislative staffers and you have oversight staffers. Legislative staffers work on legislation and oversight staffers oversee. I am an overseer. I do investigations. I don't necessarily do legislation. So we're getting slightly out of my wheelhouse. But, I think some ways that regulation gets approached when government doesn't want to be very prescriptive is we essentially say, thou shalt adhere to an industry best practice guideline. And then it's sort of unnamed. It's not specified what each of those controls are, but I think, that this is the case with some things that are now referring to the NIST framework, for example, where people are saying, we're not going to say you must do X, Y, Z, but we are going to point you towards the NIST framework, and then you can fill in the blanks yourself. I think that is pretty similar as well to what NHTSA did with their auto cybersecurity guidance, where it wasn't necessarily hugely prescriptive, but it had some basic standards of care, if you want to call it that, for what should be done. And I think that that's generally the way that it's approached, where the government will essentially say, we expect you to meet a minimum standard, but we aren't going to tell you what that minimum standard is. We expect you to get together as the industry in question and come up with something, and then you adhere to it. And that gives industry the ability to control their own destiny to a certain extent. It gives them a little bit more say in what they're going to have to adhere to. And it also speeds up the ability to update whatever it is. So if there's some huge shift in the technology or evolution in the technology, that can change much more quickly.
And we've got about 7 minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask any questions about public policy and the Internet of Things, I see we've got one there now.
I mostly just had a question about the coordinated vulnerability disclosure, because this is the first time I'm hearing this. I'm kind of interested in it. When you talk about that, is it mostly how you coordinate with the different people that you have to disclose this vulnerability to and then the public, or is it how you run through channels to start disclosing this vulnerability and then start to protect it?
Are you asking about the process and the concept of coordinated disclosure?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's some really good resources out there that you can look at to help go through it in a lot more detail. But and you're actually sitting next to a very smart person who knows a thing or two. But the idea of coordinated vulnerability disclosure is when a security researcher or anyone finds a potential security flaw in a product or a piece of software, that they can do two things with it. They can either tell someone or tell no one. And if they tell someone, how do you then tell them? And there's many different ways that you could go about doing that through, privately disclosing to the first party who made it or to a third party who didn't make it. You can publicly disclose on a mailing list or something like that. You can work with in a more staged and coordinated fashion, for instance, and that's where the bulk of this conversation has been, in a coordinated disclosure where you're working to coordinate with the people who are responsible, accountable for the vulnerabilities within those systems, who wrote the software for it or who are selling those systems. And that way, there's a chance that the vulnerability gets fixed before someone else knows about it. And then what do the escalation pathways look like if that conversation and coordination breaks down? And then engaging people like CertCC, Art Mannion sitting to your left. Probably don't email him directly, but his group can help do some of the third-party coordination. ICS Cert, I mentioned earlier, can also do some of the third-party coordination to help broker trust between researchers and software makers or device makers. And there's actually an ISO standard for how organizations, software makers, device makers would handle disclosures. There's a couple of ISO standards. I might butcher the numbers, but I think it's 29147 and 30111. Art can correct me. Yep, I get the thumbs up from Art. That's good. There's also because I've got a slide on it, I will pop that slide up. There's a NTIA document that was released in December of 2016. Vulnerability disclosures, attitudes, and actions, the result of a multi-stakeholder process. And in December 15th, they published early stage coordinated vulnerability disclosure template, as well as several other documents around this to help, by and large, industry and corporations figure out how to handle disclosures and what goes on both publicly for the policy side and then privately behind the scenes to handle them internally.
We have the next question over here.
Nice to see you both. They can't see me, so that's a little joke. Regardless of who is in political power at a particular time, a common critique of Congress is that they are beholden to special interests. And I was curious what mechanisms exist or what processes you use in order to minimize making decisions that are overtly biased, so to speak, from said special interests.
So
easy question, right?
Actually, it has an easier answer than you figure, but I think it's because of the issue set that I cover. So in Congress, usually staff cover a range of issues. So you'll be the healthcare person and the energy person and the telecom person. For me, I am only the cybersecurity person. So I cover cybersecurity all day, every day. It's all I do. And so to answer your question about how I avoid making biased decisions, I look at the technology. What can the technology support? What can't it support? What is the reality of the technology? This is a big one. Actually, I probably should have mentioned this because encryption, I assume, is a huge deal for everyone in this room. So Congress, as I'm sure many of you are aware, decided to jump into the encryption debate last year, and we did the encryption working group, and I staffed that, and we released our report in December 2016, essentially saying, don't weaken encryption. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. And I guess you could argue in that case that there were special interests on both sides. You had the law enforcement and the intelligence communities essentially saying, we'll never be able to solve another crime again. And then on the alternative side, you had companies who had said, we've got to protect dissidents, we've got to protect domestic violence victims, we've got to protect everybody. We can't do that without encryption. And so the reason that we were able to arrive at the conclusion that we did, which was don't weaken encryption, is we looked at the technology. We talked to a bunch of encryption experts. For me, frankly, I looked at the math and essentially said we cannot see a path forward where the technology will simultaneously support being weakened and still being able to do the things that it needs to be done. So at least when it comes to cybersecurity issues, I get lucky. I look at what the technology will or won't allow, and that's my policy.
I think we got time for one more question before we go to the Feds Hard Hackers panel at the top of the hour at 3 p.m.
Good afternoon. Appreciate your comments. I have a question. What are you thinking about in terms of policy as we look at Mirai and things like Mirai and botnets and all this sort of thing? How do people who operate like really important things continue to do their job in the face of non-intelligent devices that are being co-opted by adversaries to do things? Is there a thought in the policy space to provide for active defenses? I can't use that word.
Ooh, active defenses.
But
the British sense.
To allow maybe ISPs to stop unintelligent devices from just beating the heck out of poor victims.
Yes. So I'm going to try and answer quickly because I know we're running out of time. I would highly recommend. This was not planned that we keep advertising, but there are so many smart people doing panels. I would recommend that you go listen to them. I'm going to call it hackback, or active defenses in that kind of that lump them together into one kind of category of issues. Jen Ellis and Leonard Bailey. Leonard Bailey is a DOJ attorney who's incredibly smart on these issues. He's giving a talk tomorrow morning Baby got hacked back? Is that what it's called? So I would I would highly recommend that if you're interested in this issue, you go listen to them give their talk. I am highly skeptical of any active defenses or any hackback measures because, frankly, if we can't make secure systems to begin with, I don't think we have any business saying that we're going to use our skills to go attack somebody else. Like I would rather us just focus on making systems that cannot be affected through a Mirai-like action than try and take this offensive focused approach. Like in this case, I do not think the best defense is good offense, and so I would much rather us focus on the defense part.
I'm gonna try and find a slide really quickly.
Is it somebody punching somebody one?
No, it's not.
I like that one.
So we may have some options there. We may have all bad options. So this isn't a complete set of options we could take in active defense and in botnets, but you could disconnect or filter out bad actors that may lead to especially some other parts of the world taking more heavy-handed control over the internet. You may inadvertently turn off or block connected equipment like medical devices. You could try and take down the bad actors, just disconnect them completely, go after them, brick the devices. That may also lead to bad public safety outcomes. Or maybe the worst idea is you just let all of this stuff happen, which may be a terrible idea for any number of reasons. So I'm not sure that we've got a bunch of great answers at a public policy level or at a technical level necessarily. So with that, our time is well expired. So thank you all, and stick around for the next panel, Fed's Hard Hackers.
Thank you, Bo and Jessica.